So Jiva, we're going to continue our tour through the foundation frameworks. I mean, we're by no means going to cover everything, but we're trying to cover the sort of guts and the most common stuff in NSData.
Yeah, so NSData. NSData is kind of a cool class. Essentially, the purpose of NSData is to provide you with an object-oriented interface for dealing with blobs of goo. You know, ultimately, that's what it comes down to. You're dealing with blobs of memory sitting out there that you allocate, and it can contain all different kinds of stuff, whatever you want, basically.
So it's a stream of bytes, effectively.
It's a stream of bytes. That's exactly what it is. And usually, most often, it's used a lot when you're working with legacy data or when you're dealing with things from files or things from the network. For example, NSURL connection. When you get data from a website, the data is delivered as an NSData. And you can take that data and you can then say, for example, convert it to a string or whatever to get back like the HTML out of the data. So so let's take a look at some code so you can kind of see what I'm getting at here. If you can imagine dealing with maybe some legacy code where you've got a buffer that you read, you know, maybe you've got some kind of a special custom file format or something, and so you read this blob of data maybe off of disk into a standard C buffer, and that buffer has a length of 1024 bytes, just for the sake of argument, right? So imagine that those three dots are actually like allocating the memory, reading in some data. Or that, you know, that could be anything. Using NSData, you can actually take that buffer of data and actually create this object-oriented sort of wrapper around that data, that you can still access the individual bytes in that data if you want to, but the important thing is here, now you've got this object, and so you can pass it around much easier in Objective-C. You can put it in those collections that we were talking about earlier, right? All those kinds of things. So to do that, basically you construct an NSData like we're doing here, and you say, use the factory method, data with bytes, and you pass in your buffer, which needs to be a pointer of some kind to some memory that has been allocated. Right. In this case, we're passing in a char pointer. The actual method signature specifies that it be a void pointer, which really means any kind of pointer.
A pointer to something.
A pointer to something. You also need to specify the length of that data because really, I mean, again, we're just really kind of talking about a blob of goo sitting out there. The NSData class doesn't know anything about your data format. It doesn't know how far it should read in memory. And so you need to make sure that that length is, in fact, specifying the amount of data that you've got sitting there to be read. If you specify a length that's too long, then you'll actually read off the end of that buffer. If you specify a length that's too short, then you won't read all your data. So you want to make sure that that's as big as however much memory you have allocated for your buffer. Now, the traditional form of this method, the NSData data with bytes factory method, will take that buffer that you've provided it, and it will just do a byte for byte copy of that data into its own buffer. And it will then be responsible for freeing that data when you release your NSData object.
Right.
So you need to be aware of that, that if you then, after you've wrapped your buffer, your pointer in your NSData, if you go and change that original allocated memory that you had in that pointer, if you change that original version, it's not going to change the one in the NSData because
it's
NSData has its own copy and it owns it. Now, on the other hand, there is another form here called NSData data with bytes no copy, which actually does the exact opposite. It'll actually just refer directly to your data pointer, right? And so, yeah, if you make changes to that data in memory, then it will also change the one in the NSData. I don't recommend you do your changes that way. We'll see how you manipulate that data in a moment. But just in terms of, you know, this is useful in cases where you have, say, for example, a very large data set and you don't want it necessarily making a copy of that data set. Now, in that case, that data needs to have been allocated using malloc, because NSData will free that data when it's finished working with it, when you call release, by using free.
Okay, now we didn't do a lot about C-type memory management using malloc and free, right. And it's really not in the scope of this course, so people need to go look that up.
Right. It's a C thing.
Any standard C web page giving you some introduction to C memory management will tell you about it. But I think that's an important thing to know, that if you pass this data to NSData, it's going to free it afterwards.
It owns it.
It takes ownership of it.
Exactly.
I mean, once you've got an NSData object that's been created this way, is there any way of telling, or which mode it's in, or do you just have to know because you created it?
I think you just have to know. Okay. I don't know of a way to know if I don't think there's a method for that.
Okay, maybe it'd be in the docs if there is.
Yeah, you'd have to look in the docs for that. I'm not 100% sure. Now, if you want to get your data back out of there, right, then essentially you're going to copy that data back out into another buffer. That's how you would get the data back out again. Although there's ways that you can access individual bytes, but the important thing is, if you want to get all the data out, then you can use the get bytes method. Mm-hmm. And what that does is it takes another pointer, it should be probably the same kind of pointer that you use to put the data in there. And what it will do is it will actually copy that data into that pointer buffer for you. So you need to make sure that there's space in there for that data to be placed. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
So let's talk a little bit about mutability. There's also NS mutable data. Everything that we've shown there really was dealing with the immutable form of NS data, which means that you can't manipulate the data once it's in there. But let's say, for example, this is probably a common enough thing that comes up. If you have a legacy file format, something like that, where you're reading something in and you want to deal with it in an object-oriented form because you're trying to modernize your code, right? Well, you can use NS mutable data to do that. It works really. You can construct an NS mutable data using the data constructor, data factory method, or of course you can still use those NSData factory methods, because NS mutable data inherits from NSData. And then once you've got that guy, you can go ahead and append bytes to it, just like you were copying the bytes in before, just straight into the constructor. Mm-hmm. You now have a method called append bytes, which allows you to add bytes to the end of that buffer. Inside of NSData. Now, it'll do the appropriate stuff to allocate more space in there and so on and so forth. An important note here, we talked about that no copy constructor before. That's actually not available. It's the one case where that constructor, or that factory method, will throw an exception if you try to call it off of NS mutable data.
Okay.
Because it can't manipulate the buffer that you've provided. So you can't actually append data to that. Actually, I take it back. It won't throw an exception. What will happen is, if you try to call that factory method on an NS mutable data, it won't actually be copied. It will be copied rather than not copied. So you'll it'll get a working object, but it won't be the no copy version.
And I guess that's because NSData, mutable data, it needs to do its own memory management.
Correct.
If you're appending stuff, it needs to make sure it's getting new memory and all the other rest of it. And if it's actually just manipulating your C data that's been done with a malloc, that's going to get messy.
It's going to get very messy. So, don't do that. You can't do that. Now, so another way to create an NSData object is actually to read your file directly from disk. Now, actually, this needs one little correction here, because we're working with mutable data. So, in this case, we have an NS mutable data object that we are constructing by using the data with contents of file factory method. And just like when we saw with NSString, how you could read a file off of disk and have its contents come right into the NSString object, same thing here. This will read that data file right off of disk and put all of the raw bytes right into your NS mutable data object, which is really cool. That's really cool. That gives you the ability to just, read basically virtually any any file and have its data just in memory as a big blob of goo. So once you've got that blob of goo, then you can do things like, for example, replace bytes in range. And in this particular case, for example, imagine you wanted to replace a particular range of bytes that you knew contained the launch codes with some new launch codes, right? So you could replace the bytes at a particular range with new bytes, essentially. And this is just like appending bytes. It's just that you're actually replacing what's there. Now, another nice thing about this, it works kind of the same way as like replacing an object in an array. It doesn't have to do any resizing or anything. So sometimes replacing bytes in your NSData object might actually be faster than like, removing bytes and adding bytes and things like that. Now, once you've done whatever manipulation you wanted to do, then there's also some convenience methods like this one here, which is gives you the ability to write that data to a file. I think we saw a few of these cases. There's a lot of these write to file methods available on a lot of these foundation classes, like NS Dictionary allows you to write it out as a plist. There's also one on NS String and so forth. I'll make note of it here in case we didn't mention it before. You have the optional parameter of atomically, which is kind of cool. What that does is it will write your file out to a temporary, or it'll write your data out to a temporary file first. And then once that file operation has completed, it will then move the original file out of the way, rename your written file to the correct file name, and then delete the original file. That way, in case your application crashes halfway through writing the data out to disk, you don't get a corrupt file.
And the default is yes, or the default is no?
Well, I think you have to pass it every time. I don't think there is one that doesn't take
no default.
the atomically
Okay, right, that's
parameter. Fine. I'm pretty sure. So that's pretty much the gist of NSData. It's a very powerful class. Like I said, it's really useful for dealing with legacy data. It's also used a lot in cases where you're dealing with NS-URL connection. You've got files that you're downloading. You're sucking them in. You're storing them away. One of the cool things. So I mean, just because that's such a common. I would say it's a pretty common common design pattern that you're going to wind up using with NSData. Often you'll have a delegate method off of NS-URL connection that I think is something like, void connection something or other did receive data, and then that comes in with an NSData object there.
So this is NS-URL has a delegate,
right? So, that returns this guy.
It's passing it off for you to do whatever you like.
Right, and so usually what you wind up doing is you have your own data object there, and you'll do an append data call off of that, and you'll just take that new data and just add that onto the end of it. And then when the connection finishes loading, then at that point your data is finished, and you'll do something like, I think there's an NS string method that will, and there we go. There's an NS string method that will allow you to do, I'm pretty sure there's NS string with data with encoding or something along those lines. So you can take that NS data that you've already got there and just convert it right into an NS string. Now again, it's going to take that string encoding parameter so that you can specify whether it's NSUTF-8 encoding and so on and so forth. Okay, so that was a little bit of off the fly, top of the head extra stuff.
We've been sat here a long time. So the principles, what have been said there, are all good. That last little section, maybe some of the names are slightly out, but it'll all be in the docs. You just need to know to look it up and know that you can do it. NSData, a great way of dealing with things. Now, I get the sense that today is the day for the next section.
Today is the day for the next section. It is indeed.
Because we are going to be dealing with
dates.
Quite right.